Klamath and Modoc Indians signed a treaty in 1864 that wasn't ratified by the US government until 6 years later in 1870 because of the Civil War. That treaty was terminated in 1954 and then restored in 1986. And since that time in 86, the Klamath tribes in particular have grown and provide quite a few jobs and resources here in the county. Since our program today is based on horticulture, I thought I would mention a native plant that is important to the indigenous Klamath tribes here, and that's the Wokus lily. The Wokus lily is a plant that is not found in a whole lot of different parts of the state, but is important to the traditional tribal health and foods. I think we're also going to have a link in the chat that is a map that shows anywhere in the US you can look and see where the native peoples were and what tribes were. And I was struck when I was checking that map out by all of the different colors that overlay that represent the different tribes, that all of those colors represent so much more eloquently than I can how much we don't know about those native folks and how much culture and different peoples there are there to learn more about. So that link will be in the chat for folks that want to take a closer look at that. We're going to talk about understanding seed characteristics today. So all of us as gardeners are likely to plant seeds at some time in our lives, and there are endless choices out there. So our goal today is to help you understand more about those seed characteristics. We're going to start off with the insider codes. This is really super secret information that a lot of people don't have access to. So say you're perusing a seed catalog and you see the words extremely vigorous. You might think about that as translating that to a plant with the capacity to eat your house. Plants for the seasoned gardener, that's secret code for most people are going to kill this plant. Think twice before you get that one. Vegetables that are suggested we pick often, those are like the zucchinis that if you miss them, turn to baseball bat size by evening. Sweet and tender are particularly appreciated by insects who say it tastes great. Prolific yielders are things that we hope your friends also like. And quick ripening fruit is important to keep a close look on because it goes from rock hard to mushy overnight. Now that's a little bit of horticulture humor there. Those aren't real codes that are used in seed catalogs. But would you believe there are secret codes that are used in seed catalogs? It is a real thing. This part's humor. We'll dig into the real ones in just a minute. What I hope that, what we're going to cover today is looking at, in particular, some of the descriptive terminology that's used for seeds. So we won't be focusing so much on the biology of seeds or the anatomy of seeds, but more about the terms that are used in the industry that help you determine the characteristics of a seed and whether it might be helpful for your particular situation. And so what we're really digging into is understanding the differences between different cultivars and then using that information to select the seeds that are best for us. So we'll look at things like days to maturity, disease resistance, and then also some seed saving and germination tips to get you started. My hope is that this knowledge that you gain during this time is going to help you be able to hone down on the cultivar or cultivars that best suit your needs. And then using the information that we learn from seed technology and the information that's available to us in our seed packets and catalog, it should help you to create some more realistic expectations about harvest and about what works and doesn't work for seed saving. So we're hoping this is going to get your the first part of your gardening season with the seeds off to a great start. I want to stop for a moment and talk about the differences in what you might find by using a mail order or web-based seed catalog as opposed to checking out the seeds that you find at a local hardware store or big box store versus what you might find at an independent garden center. So when we use a catalog, this is where we typically find the most abundant choices. So this is where we're most likely to find the cultivars or types that fit a diverse range of needs. This is also true at our independent garden centers, but at our big box stores, we're probably more likely going to find a smaller range of seed that's available to us, and seed varieties that are pretty good for a wide ranging area. So here in Oregon, for instance, we might encounter in a big box store a selection of seeds called Pacific Northwest. But you gardeners know that that encompasses a wide range of growing climates. And so what might be better for me over here in Klamath Falls might not be the best choice for Erica or Pammy or some of you that are over on the western side of the state closer to the coast. So a seed catalog is also helpful in terms of really getting good descriptors about what those different attributes are that are going to help you meet the specific needs. So for example, you'll have much more information about the seasonality. I was surprised when I found out, for instance, that there are broccolis that perform much better in the spring, and there are broccolis that perform better in the fall, and those are different cultivars. You'll learn about the specific culture and harvest rates that go with the seeds that you choose. And again, finding the best cultivar for your job. These wide choices that are available to us with catalogs or at independent garden centers also create some challenges, though. When you add all those abundant choices and then the habit forming nature of gardening, what we end up with sometimes is a need to restrict those sources or those choices. So, for instance, we might think about some parameters that help us from choosing too many so we don't end up with way more seeds than we can possibly use. One of the tricks I learned from some of the commercial growers I used to like to work with is that they would limit themselves to 3 to 5 new things a year rather than getting excited about all the new things that were out there, to try just a few of those, but to lean primarily on those tried and true cultivars that they knew performed really well in their particular growing situation. I would also recommend that we think about what is the most efficient for each of us to grow. So maybe we don't want to invest in seed and then the time and labor and work that comes with for those things that are the hardest to grow in a particular area, or maybe the cheapest to buy at the grocery store. So here in Klamath, carrots are really, really inexpensive. Um, they're also pretty easy to grow. So things like onions, I find as a home gardener that to grow a bulbing onion is pretty difficult to grow. And those are widely abundant in our area. So those are two things that I might not dedicate seed energy and garden space to, just based on the fact that they're easily available in my area or very expensive or very inexpensive in my area. Where something like fancy leafy greens or tomatoes might be something that I can grow that would be more expensive to purchase in a different way. It sounds intuitive, but don't grow things your family doesn't like. If only one person's going to eat it, it might not be worth that. And unless, of course, is something that you can't get easily somewhere else. And then there might be some reason to only purchase for the upcoming season, especially if you're going to move or if your life circumstances might be changing in the near future. Sometimes it's helpful to remember that in January when you open up that catalog or that website and see all those awesome seed choices out there. Some of the things that worked really well for me, for instance, when I live in North Carolina, didn't work very well for me here in Oregon. So I shared those seeds with friends there before moving out. And then a tip that's more relevant to this year based on some of the folks in the industry that I've talked to is that we might consider being more willing to accept substitutions, and might even include that in the notes on our seed order this year, because it's expected that there will be small shortages here and there. This is not intended to create a panic, like there's not going to be any garden seeds, but because it was so much more popular last year, there will be some things that are not as abundant. So accepting similar substitutions might be a way to expedite your order and make sure that you get something. If you don't write that, a lot of seed companies won't substitute. Check the terms. All right, speaking of terms, let's take a look at some. We'll start off with hybrid. So hybrid cultivars are a cross of two different varieties. There are two different parents with distinctly different characteristics. And it often takes a whole bunch of crosses, or in other words, a whole lot of hand pollination and record keeping and research to identify those desirable traits that we might want to use for cultivar or variety of seeds that's actually offered on the market. Now, the seed that comes from the fruit that you of the hybrid seed, I'm going to restate that to make it more clear. When you buy a hybrid seed, you plant that plant and the resulting fruit develops seed. That seed is usually sterile. Sometimes it germinates and then produces really weakling offspring that doesn't do very much. And occasionally you even get fruit off of a hybrid seed, very occasionally, but typically the offspring is not much like what you expect it to be. One of the benefits of a hybrid, though, is that they're usually pretty prolific. And so for the home gardener, this might mean that you're able to get more food off of one plant and have need to plant fewer plants. They're chosen for a variety of characteristics like the color, the size, the flavor, the longevity, and we'll dig into how those differ between commercial and home cultivars a little later. And just to clarify, there are a few vegetables that have GMO seeds, but those are currently not available to home gardeners. So we won't be talking about GMO seeds in this discussion. So let's move on to heirloom and open pollinated seeds. Those two terms are often used in conjunction with one another. An heirloom is a variety that's been in circulation a long time. Depending on the reference that you use or the resource, you might find it quoted as anywhere from 50 to 100 years that a variety needs to be in circulation to be considered an heirloom. Heirlooms are often known for having outstanding and unique flavor, but sometimes not great disease resistance. Tomatoes are a great example of that. Heirlooms are often associated with a specific georegion where they developed or grow particularly well. Open pollinated seeds are ones where the offspring of that plant is going to have the same characteristics as the previous generation. So you might think about that as the opposite of a hybrid. If you're interested in seed saving, you'll have far better success with open pollinated seeds than with heirloom seeds. So when we think about the attributes, we said that hybrid seeds often have different attributes, right? So some examples of this, if you want to dig into some of the extreme examples, you might check out the websites at Totally Tomatoes and Vermont Bean Seed. And I think the links for those will be posted for you so that you can easily click on them. But these are entities that specialize in the whole range of things that might be available for those vegetables. So in particular for the tomatoes, as you can see from these pictures pulled from the Totally Tomatoes catalog, there's practically a tomato for every shape, size, stripe, coloration that you can possibly imagine. And so if you're a tomato enthusiast, this might be a lot of fun for you. We also see some of these used in specialty situations. And then in that Totally Tomatoes catalog, you'll even find grafted tomatoes. We'll talk more about those. Likewise, with the Vermont bean seed, they have some other vegetables as well, but just an opportunity to look at the wide range of cultivars that are out there and to recognize that they all have a different use, right? There's beans for drying, there's beans for canning and preserving, and there's beans that do best for fresh eating. When we think about hybrids that are developed for commercial viability, the attributes are very different than what we think of for home use. So in a past project, I did some work with tomatoes for processing. And I learned that one of the key breeding attributes of a tomato for processing is that it shakes off of the plant very easily, and the stem and petiole fall off of the fruit very easily, so that when it rolls down the conveyor belt, those stems don't poke into the other fruit and compromise it. You don't find that with a lot of, say, the heirloom tomatoes or the tomatoes that we're going for the fresh market. Those are usually going to still have that stem and pedicel attached. And so that's a really important attribute for a commercial processing tomato, but is completely unimportant, for instance, for a home tomato, where we're really more focused on things like flavor and compatibility with the growing region and that type of thing. There's a whole category of cantaloupes and melons called Western shippers. Those are abundant in the commercial industry. And as you might guess from that category name, they're melons that hold up to shipping very well. Where some of our heirloom melons might have way superior flavor, but have thinner skins or shorter shelf life, such that they don't ship very well. So one of the advantages that we have as home gardeners is that we can focus on the varieties that have the attributes that make sense for our home use. And we don't have to think about things like uniformity or whether the stem is going to drop off. I'll pause for questions in just a minute. So just in terms of understanding the relationships between some of those terms that we just talked about, I've got a little horticultural math here for you. So hybrid does not equal open pollinated. So in other words, those are not going to have the same characteristics or viability in terms of seed saving. Hybrid, not so great. Open pollinated, pretty good. All heirlooms are open pollinated, but not all open pollinated seeds are heirlooms. So the difference between the two of those is the age, right? So the heirlooms are those seeds that have been in circulation for a long time and remained consistent over decades. That's due to that open pollination. They consistently have those same attributes. But there are some newer open pollinated varieties on the market that are not heirloom. Not tons of them, but there are some to be aware of. So those two terms are often used together, but they're not exactly equivalent. And again, if one of your goals is to be able to save seed, then it's really important to remember that hybrids are not going to be very helpful for that. It's the open pollinated seeds that will be more appropriate for seed saving. All right, so I think that's a good place to stop for questions. I saw that somebody had a raised hand. Those others of you that are moderating, are there relevant questions that we could be checking in?
I don't see any other questions in the Q&A at the moment. We did have one about seed. How long do seeds keep? And so I put a reference in there, but maybe you could touch on that real quick.
It's coming. In general, 1 to 5 years, and it varies per seed family. And we do have a link coming up to that, I believe, later on in the slides that has a table with that. In general, celery, parsley, things in the Apiaceae family, the carrots, those seeds don't usually last as long. Things like beans last the longest, and squashes are somewhere in the middle, but we'll look at that a little more.
And then we have one other question real quick. Would you define cultivar?
Yeah, I thought I had that in a previous slide, but my order, I changed. I played with them a little bit last night and confused myself. It is coming, but that is a great point. So cultivar is actually a horticultural contraction that means cultivated variety. And so a cultivar is to have distinct characteristics that are describable, consistent, and reliable, and different from another plant. So for instance, a Merlot loose leaf lettuce has dark burgundy leaves that are kind of frilly, and frisee lettuce is a loose leaf lettuce that's green and has really dissected super frizzy leaves. Both of those are loose leaf lettuces, but those cultivars have different characteristics. There's also some differences, for instance, in the size of the head and how long it takes to mature. So it's a contraction for cultivated variety.
Okay, and I do have a couple of hands up here. I'm going to get to the ones in the Q&A at the maybe towards the end, but let's see here. Sharon, you have your hand up. I'm going to allow you to talk and ask your question. Okay, looks like Sharon's not talking right now. Sharon, if you can put your question in the Q&A, that would help. Gloria, you have a question?
Try again.
I think in this format, since we have so many people, instead of raising your hand, could you please put your questions, type them in the Q&A, and that will allow us to get to all of them systematically. Thank you.
Thanks, Pammy. All right, so let's look at a few more terms. All right, another one that we should be aware of is the germination standard. Sometimes you'll see this as a percentage and it'll say seed lot test or tested germination rate, but these are a rate of or a percentage of the seeds that you should expect to sprout or germinate. And it's not always 100%. I flipped through a couple seed catalogs and just to show a range of some of the things here that are common. So celery is fairly low of a germination rate compared to tomatoes being at 80%, celery 65, corn somewhere in the middle. Some few vegetables have a surprisingly low germination rate. A lot of varieties of edamame, their germination rate is really, really slow. That's actually one of the things that makes it more challenging for growers to more growers to offer that, is because the seed is expensive and it doesn't germinate very well. So that percentage corresponds to the test year or the year that the seed was purchased usually. So that percentage is not going to remain that high over time, right? Our germination rate is going to decline, and that varies with the seed type over time. And so I do think, if I got myself out of order, I apologize, but I think we do have a link that shares some of those seed links, I think later when we talk about saving seed. All right, so just be aware that you don't want to buy necessarily 3 to 5 years worth of seed, because particularly if it's something with a low germination standard, then by the time you get to year 3 or 5, it's not going to germinate that well. So what you're trying to do is not have an overabundance of seed stored for future use. All right, let's look at a few more terms. We're going to tackle conventional and organic next. So conventional refers to all the hybrids or most of the hybrids and all those kind of commercial types of seed that are really widely available. So they're purchased pretty widely. Some of you probably know some of these cultivars. You know, I think of Big Boy tomatoes and Early Girl tomatoes and the slicing cucumber straight 8. It's been out forever. You know, some of these have purple top turnips, for instance. They've been out for years and years. They produce fairly well over a huge part of the country. And so they work really well for mass production. They can be shipped all over the country. So that's a really generic term, conventional, and it could apply both to varieties that are appropriate for home use and those that are more appropriate for commercial seed. Organic seed refers to seed that are from crops raised only using approved natural substances for 3 years or more. And so sometimes the seed is actually a limiting factor in commercial organic production. There's not always as much organic seed as there is demand for organic seed. There's actually a classification in labeling food products organic that allows for this. So 100% organic food includes that organic seed, but then organic food might have every input organic except for the seed, in recognition of this fact that organic seed is sometimes a limiting factor. Organic seed might be hybrid or it might be heirloom. As organic has gained a big market share, the number of hybrid organics that are available to home growers has actually increased. So hybrid is not necessarily always equivalent only to conventional seed. And as I mentioned before, sometimes organic growers have to use the conventional seed and then have all the other inputs organic in order to be able to offer a crop. So in terms of differences, I suspected that folks might be interested in understanding the differences in performance between those two seeds. And there's typically not, in any research that I could find, a performance difference in the seed and how the seed germinates. Often differences in those crops come later because of how we might manage them differently. But there was some research that came from the from the University of Wisconsin a few years ago that just demonstrates, here it may be small for you to see, but there is a significant premium towards organic seeds, somewhere around 20 to 50%. And that about 65% of crops, I think, demonstrated this big disparity between organic and conventional seeds. So that's just something to be aware of, that you might expect to pay a little bit higher price for that. And that goes back to the fact that there are specific inputs over multiple years that go into gaining that certification. So again, it's just helpful to know that you might expect to pay a premium there. I also wanted to cover a couple terms that are specific to some of the things we do with our seed. So I'm often surprised how many people have never used inoculant with their beans. So an inoculant is actually a nitrogen fixing bacteria that is often sold along with bean seeds. Most of it's in a powder form and you just soak the beans in it before you plant them. But it actually increases the beans' ability and capacity to do that nitrogen fixing that they do in the soil, which is a very simplified way to put that, is that the beans can pull the nitrogen from the soil and almost fertilize themselves. This can also aid in more uniform germination so that your beans all come up at more close to the same time. And you often find this in your independent garden centers and in your seed catalogs. It tends to be tougher to find in your big box type of stores. But bean inoculant, and again, that is a beneficial bacteria that helps our beans to fix nitrogen in the soil. Another term that you're likely to come across if you look in a seed catalog is that you'll see a notation that some of the seed is pelleted. And pelleted seed refers to seed that's treated with clay or chalk to make it easier to handle. That's different than treated seed. And these are generally distinguishable visually, because if a seed's been treated with chemical, that's usually got some color or dye in it so that you know that right away. Whereas a pelleted seed that's been treated with clay or chalk is going to look kind of brown or muddy or chalky. It's very different than the color dye that would be associated with a treated seed. So don't be afraid that pelleted seed means it's coming with something scary on it. All right. So another one that's really helpful for us as we're trying to pick which variety is going to work best is to really have a good understanding of determinate and indeterminate. This most commonly applies to tomatoes and beans. And it has to do with the way that the plants develop and grow over time. So a determinate plant or tomato or bean plant is going to set most of its fruit at roughly the same time. You're going to be able to harvest it all at one time. And then that's pretty much done. So most of our paste and sauce tomatoes, for instance, will be determinate, and you're going to collect all of them at one time and have a big canning party, and then they're done. The opposite of that then is the indeterminates that produce a small amount of fruit, but virtually all over the whole season. So those might be managed very differently. They're producing fruit at different rates, although ultimately the pounds of yield might be the same. In a determinate plant, you're going to get it all at one time. And in an indeterminate plant, you're going to get it spaced out in chunks over time. Typically, our determinate plants are shorter and more compact, so they may be appropriate for those of us with raised beds, with community garden space, with patio gardens, those of us that have to garden in small spaces. A determinate variety is likely to be a space-saving choice. And again, these are the ones that are going to make it easier to have that big batch of stuff to can or preserve all at one time. So the indeterminate plants are going to be the ones that are longer. So that's like the pole beans, and they'll produce smaller amounts. So here's just a visual in greenhouse tomatoes. For the commercial industry, many of those are indeterminate, and they actually just keep those plants going on and on and on. And the vines are stripped of their leaves after the fruit is produced, so that only the top has the fruit and the leaves, and the vines just kind of come down. I've even seen pictures where you can see the vines coiled at the base. So these indeterminate plants, with the right climate conditions, like are provided in this greenhouse, can actually keep producing for a very long time. Whereas the determinate plants are usually more bushy. And then I learned in putting this together for you that there are now Roma tomatoes that are called semi-determinate. That was a new phrase for me. And as you might imagine, that's kind of in the middle between those. So a moderately rambling plant as opposed to one that's going to grow really, really long. So we're going to focus now on disease management. Pammy, do you see questions in the Q&A before I move on?
Yes, we have quite a few, and I'm trying to answer kind of the easy ones by typing. Do you want me to go through some of them right now?
If you're able to cover them by typing, that's really helpful. It'll help us stay on track. And I'll check in again. Does that work?
Yeah, let me see here. One question, maybe you can real quickly, the best way to store inoculant?
So that's probably something that's going to need to be bought every year. And
okay.
Doesn't want to get super hot. You want to keep it away from high temperatures and extremes in temperatures. So hot, cold is typically not helpful. Good question.
Okay. Yeah, I looked online and it said probably the fridge, but not the freezer. Sue was asking, she was surprised that people, and I don't know much about this question, she was surprised that people cannot buy GMO seeds. Heard that 95% of corn and soybeans are GMO. Does that mean all of those GMO seeds are used commercially?
Yeah, so there are way different provisions with that. And the seed is also way more expensive. So if we were purchasing GMO seed as homeowners, we would probably notice that in the pocketbook. But yes, it's being purchased by the commercial growers, and they typically have to, there's some licensing involved with that. So depending, they may have to actually sign or certify that they're not going to repurpose that seed in any way, because it's considered patented material. So it's a little different.
Okay, and kind of along those lines, are conventional seeds themselves actually treated with different chemicals versus organic seed, or is it just the material that they come from?
Not necessarily. Most conventional seed has probably not been treated with a chemical. Now, you will find, particularly in the brassicas and the cucurbits, some seed has been heat treated because there's a few soil-borne diseases that can be carried on the seed coat itself. So particularly in those two families, and I think more in the brassicas. So that's your kale, collards, cabbage, turnips, all that stuff. Sometimes those are treated to kill anything that's on the seed coat, but it's a lot of times it's a heat or a hot water for a very specific amount of time and not necessarily a chemical.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question before you move on. Can a determinate plant be an open pollinated plant?
Yes. So those categories are not mutually exclusive or related to each other. Good questions. That's why
All right.
I categorize the ones that kind of go together, because you're right. They're describing completely different things. So it could be conventional and pelleted and hybrid, or it could be organic and determinate and pelleted potentially. So I mean, there's not mutual exclusivity for a lot of these. Good questions. So looking on to disease management, what we typically see reference to in seed information is resistance. So this means the plant is less likely to exhibit any symptoms of the disease, period. Occasionally, you'll also see plants that are tolerant to a disease. So I see this sometimes in the cucurbits, the squashes and melons and pumpkins, and the mildews. Some of those will just completely collapse when the mildews hit them, and others will tolerate it. And so the plant will still live, but it shows the symptoms and is probably less productive. Whereas a resistant plant doesn't show the symptoms at all. I wanted to mention that grafting is a thing that's used to confer disease resistance. It's used a lot in tomatoes and melons, and most frequently for soil-borne diseases, right? So you see a lot of heirloom tomatoes now being offered with grafting, and some of our melons being offered with grafting. So what they're doing is putting rootstock on, they're using rootstock with disease resistance, and they're matching that with the tops of plants or the scions of plants that have the attributes that we want. Heirloom, particularly good flavor, or what have you. So those plants are really, really expensive. In that Totally Tomatoes catalog, for instance, that I mentioned, I think the grafted plants run $13 a piece. So that's a significant difference. If there is a history of soil-borne disease in a particular garden space, that's probably the most likely reason that you would invest in that higher amount for a single plant. You wanted a plant that had those particular attributes like that heirloom, but you've got a history of particular diseases. And I would mention as well that tolerance and resistance are really, really helpful in your humid and wet areas where your leaves stay wet a lot. So when you have moisture that sits on the leaf for a long time, that's one of the key ingredients that sets the plant up to be susceptible to disease. So those of you on the wet side of the state, it's worthwhile to take a look at some of these resistances. So we don't endorse specific companies. I've mentioned some specific companies here just as examples. Those are not endorsements. But for this resistance key section, I have used information from the Territorial Seed Company catalog, which is regional to the Pacific Northwest. And so extracted from their section on beans, you can see a bunch of different letters here that correspond to different diseases. As I told you at the beginning of the talk, that there actually were secret seed codes, and now you see that they're here. So these are helpful for you, particularly if you've been gardening in a spot for a long time and there's some disease that just keeps coming back every year, or that you've experienced multiple times. You know, one of the things that's recommended for disease management is rotation. But some of us are in small spaces. Some of us might be patio gardeners, and rotation has its limitations in a small space. So disease resistance is another thing to think about. Notice here that there's a lot of options for resistance in beans, but far less in cabbage and corn. I think lettuce has the least resistances of any of the vegetables last time I checked. Cucumbers have a variety of them. The downy mildews are particularly challenging for the cucumbers and other members of that family. So in areas where downy mildew is a problem, resistant varieties would make a huge difference and make it much easier for you to work around those diseases without having to use a lot of preventative chemicals. So this is really worth digging into, and is another example of where you're going to get more detailed information if you're working with the independent garden center or with a seed catalog than those very widely generic mass-produced commercial seeds. Cucumbers have another layer of secret code. So there's been all this interesting breeding that's been going on in cucumbers, and some of the seed has started to make its way where it's available to the home gardener. So again, this information is partly taken from the territorial seed catalog, but some of the breeding in cucumbers in particular means that it's not as necessary to have a pollinator. So in our gynoecious cucumbers, almost all of the flowers are female. So they almost all have the potential to set fruit. That's great, but many of them are going to need another variety that is not gynoecious, because female flowers don't have pollen. Male flowers have pollen. So they have the variety, they have the capacity to set fruit, but they need that other variety in there. So these are way more widely used commercially. One of the primary reasons that growers like these is because they can send pickers through the field twice a week instead of every day. That is groundbreaking in terms of labor for them. So it makes it worthwhile for the commercial growers to use that second pollinizer variety and not have to pick the field every day. When you're talking about 5 acres of cucumbers, for instance, that makes a huge difference. So naturally, members of this plant family have male and female flowers that are separate, but on the same vine. And so typically with your squashes and cucumbers, your first few blooms are male flowers that don't have the capacity to set fruit. And then after those first few male flowers, you get some female flowers, your ratio of male and females works out, and then you're in business. There's a few hermaphroditic cucumber plants that actually have male and female parts within a single flower. So those are self-fertile. And a single plant can fertilize different flowers, so that second pollinizer variety is not necessary. Then we have the traditional or natural state for this plant, where there are separate male and female flowers on one plant. That is the typical state. And then we also have parthenocarpic cucumbers, which set fruit without pollination at all. And so these are actually, the fruit set is triggered by temperature and day length, and they may or may not also be gynoecious. So those may or may not be the same variety. So if you look at some of these seed catalogs, you'll see some notations for a few of these newer cucumbers. Probably of the most interest to our commercial growers, they will be a little bit more expensive. But if you're really into pickling or cucumbers, or you're just interested in how these plants might perform differently, now you know. All right, so wrapping up that section again, I just think that one of the things that I found is that when I try to save seed packets, whether I tape them to a journal or put them in some file somewhere, so I have the variety information to fall back on, that does never holds up as well for me as just marking the things in the catalog that I ordered and making notes in the catalog itself. So for me, I find it to have that added advantage of becoming almost a journal for my gardening for that year. You're going to have a wide variety of information. Sometimes it's available in the seed packet, sometimes not. Most seed packets are small. There's only so much they can get on there and us still be able to read it. So if you use a catalog, you're often able to refer to charts in the catalog itself that are going to give you way more detailed information that might help you determine, for instance, exactly how much seed you need or how much you might expect to yield from that. You all might also pick up some great clues for which diseases and insects to be on the lookout for. So an example of one company that's also regionally appropriate is Mowing Seed Company. That's an organic seed company. And again, we're just bringing up different examples here, but I would encourage you to check out the blog area of their website. This is where they've put a lot of that additional information. So there's a section on tips for new gardeners. There's insights into their breeding program. So they actually tell the story of how they get some of their different varieties. So for those of you that are more interested in how that works, that might be one place to get information straight from the folks that are selling the seed. And then a less regionally specific example, but I still have to give them a shout out because they do the best example I've ever seen of one planting chart in one double page that has such great detail with all the information based on 100 feet. So if you have 10 feet of garden space dedicated to that vegetable, the math is really easy to do, and it's really easy to kind of calculate how much you need of things and how much you might expect to get. So have to give them a shout out for doing a great job there. So again, cultivar, a cultivated variety. It's just a fancy name for each of the specific varieties that we have. But regardless of what your desire is in terms of growing vegetables, there is a cultivar for that. I think the kids would say like there's an app for that, right? There's a cultivar for that. So, let's think about peppers. Any range of sweetness to hotness that you can imagine, how you like to use them. Pickling, stuffing. I love to make stuffed peppers. So I love a bell pepper that's got a nice flat bottom on it because it works better for my favorite recipe. So that's an attribute that I look for. Some of them taste great, but they're really bumpy on the bottom. Cucumbers, same thing. Are you going to grow it in a greenhouse? You might want to consider a variety specifically for the greenhouse. Those tend to perform better. Think about the fact that they need pollination. If it's shut in a greenhouse and pollinators can't get to it, you might think about some of those special secret coated cucumbers. Many of those are for greenhouse production. With lettuce, we have things like heat versus frost tolerance. So you might pick a different lettuce for early and late in the season as opposed to the middle of the summer because they have different tolerances for temperatures. You might like a heading lettuce versus a loose leaf lettuce. Heading lettuces are a little tougher for the beginner to grow. Loose leaf lettuces are easier and sometimes have multiple cuts. You might look at things for bolting resistance. So here in Klamath, we typically have a huge disparity between our daily highs and lows, which is conducive to our lettuce bolting. So that might be something that we specifically look for. With onions, it really makes a difference where you are in terms of latitude, which onions will do well for you. So you really want to understand short versus long day, but there is a cultivar. And if you're like me and you have a hard time growing a bulbing onion, we can just grow it for the tops. There's a cultivar for that too. On and on forever, right? And then again, tomatoes, there's so many different types of tomatoes. All right, so we might also think about some of the other aspects of the cultivar to help us pick what's best for our particular job. So for those of you that have a long growing season, you might be able to get multiple plantings of something for different maturity times, or you might plant all at the same time, but have, for instance, with beans, a 65-day variety, an 80-day variety, and a 100-day variety. That way you're not picking all your different kinds of beans at the same time. There's a wide disparity in your seeds from one cultivar to the next in terms of what they might cost. Hopefully some of the insights that you got today might help you understand what some of those reasons might be. We can look into the types of flavors that we like the best and just eliminate and not even look at the catalogs for those commercial seeds. Our own performance history. So if you keep notes about what you've ordered and you know that something works really well or doesn't in your garden, then you can base your future choices on that performance history. So likewise, we can think about how we're going to eat it. Is it best for fresh or for freezing? Or there are also cultivars that might work well for both of those. Convenience can play into it too. So we talked about the stems that fall off of the tomatoes. That's a commercial consideration. But have you ever tried to wash dirt out of that super crinkly spinach? It's really hard. So if you have a really windy area where the sand and the soil is blown into your spinach, then a smooth leaved variety is going to be much easier for you to clean and get the grit out of than a crinkly or Savoy leaved variety would be. Is it something that you're going to be able to remove the seeds from? Are there lots of seeds, right? So with cucumbers and squash, there's a big disparity there. With beans, how easy are they to shell, or do we need to shell them? Are they stringless? Some melons actually have a ripening cue that we can see, so we don't have to guesstimate when it's ready to harvest. I think that's a helpful attribute for a lot of new folks. Pumpkins, you know, here in Klamath Falls, we have a short growing season. So if I was going to grow a pumpkin, I'd grow a small pie pumpkin or one that I was going to hopefully harvest the seed and roast from. But I wouldn't try to grow an ego pumpkin that was the biggest ever pumpkin, because my growing season isn't long enough and I'm probably just going to be disappointed. So again, I hope that you'll spend some time thinking about what these attributes mean to your actual use and whether it makes sense for your growing season. Take a look at dry beans and winter squash. Those are great things for preserving and putting away, but pay close attention to how long it takes those things to mature. Over here in Klamath Falls, some of those are right on the edge of impossibility for our short growing season. We can also think about how much restraint we might want to use. So typically we overestimate how much seed we need. Remember, it's going to become less viable. This is where that viability chart might get plugged in so that you guys and folks can check into that if you want to get more specific. Again, 1 to 5 years, depending on the vegetable type. So you might, if you're thinking about building up a bank of seeds, you might start small and increase incrementally, because ideally you're going to have to rotate that out. Even under the best storage conditions, some of your seed will start to age out. So you can think about sharing seed libraries. I got a lot of questions about seed libraries this year, so people are already thinking about that type of things. If you don't have a seed catalog that specifies how many seeds to the gram or the ounce for a particular vegetable, one rule of thumb that might be helpful is to keep it in mind that small seed like lettuce or tomatoes is often sold by the grams, but large, heavy seed like bean is more often sold by the ounces. So sometimes you can make a inference from the way that the seed is packaged, or from the size of the seed and the packaging, to help you get an idea of how many seeds might be there. And then some of those special seeds like the tomato, specialty tomatoes and cucumbers are actually sold by the each. So those will be really special plants. All right, consider the number of people in your family and the fresh versus storage ratio, which I've never been able to get right so far. Right. And then what do you like to prepare the best? And then what's going to actually save you money versus being more work than you're actually saving money for? Some things are easily accessible, or we have friends that grow a lot of them and that type of thing. So sometimes thinking about that situation objectively can help us from going crazy. All right, we have just a couple minutes left to cover some of the basics with seed saving. So most important is protection from heat, light, moisture, and pests. So you're looking at something that's airtight. Lots of folks use a dedicated freezer or dedicated refrigerator, like a small personal refrigerator that they might store seed in. But again, you'd still want it to be airtight within that. You don't want any fluctuation with humidity. The biggest problem that zaps seed viability is fluctuation. So like your attic, where it's hot in the summer and cold in the winter, would be like the absolute, or your garage, not a good spot. You want a place that the temperature is going to stay at least the same, even if that has to be room temperature and not refrigeration. Consistent temperature is really, really helpful. And then again, as they age and have a lower germination rate. A good rule of thumb to keep in mind is that at 20% germination, plants are probably going to be pretty weak even if they do germinate. So that's probably a good time to toss that seed out. If you do a germination test and you're at somewhere around 20%, it's probably not worth the effort to put into those guys, right? So starting seed anytime from now to April, depending on how eager you are and where you are. So here in Klamath, we all get excited about that 1 or 2 nice spring days we get, but our gardening season doesn't start for much longer. Starting the seeds too early and then having these long leggy things to transplant is not really helpful. Generally, smaller seeded items benefit from transplanting more than larger seeded things like beans and sunflowers. But if you're in an area like Klamath with a short growing season, like much of Oregon is, sometimes there is a value to transplanting. So seed starting indoors and then transplanting things like squash, beans, sunflowers that normally you would just direct seed outside because our season is so short, particularly if you have a long day to maturity cultivar. Plan ahead for the room, the light, the soil temperature. So seeds germinate more uniformly if the soil temperature is consistent. There's an ideal temperature for most seeds to germinate, and you might be surprised that the ideal germination temp is usually not the same as the ideal growing temperature. That's counterintuitive, but is often the case. Think about grouping your cool and warm season vegetables together. That way, if you're starting seeds of all your cool season stuff, it's going to have similar needs. And then you'll run all that through and then maybe start warm season stuff in a separate batch because they're going to need things a little bit different. And then keep in mind that the soil temperature is important. I said that twice on purpose. You should be able to use some of the information on the seed packet or the catalog to calculate with your frost dates when is a good time to start. Starting them too early and then having seedlings that are tough to take care of is a common mistake. All right, so wrapping up, we can stagger our plantings or use different days to maturity. That works best where you have a long growing season or you're using season extension. And those are important tools for spreading out the harvest because sometimes when we garden, we get so much material at one time, it can be overwhelming in terms of what we're going to do to it. For those of us on the side of the state with the short growing season, we want to look for those varieties that have the shortest days to maturity. So all that stuff about flavor and picking the variety that suits your needs, for those of us with that short growing season, the days to maturity is often going to be what determines which of 2 varieties we might choose. And we should be choosing the one with shorter days. You know, we've developed a saying here in Klamath that our growing season is about 90 to 100 days long, but there's a frost in the middle of that. So that really impacts what we're able to do. So think about how long it's going to take those. There's a huge disparity within one vegetable group. So with lettuce, you might have as quick as a 30-day lettuce and as long as a 60. All right. So remember, our seedlings are most vulnerable in their first few weeks. That's when we might think about using heated pad to get that nice germination uniform. Germination chambers are pretty easy to build that can give us some humidity in there if you want to get really into your seed starting. Remember that strong light that is close to the seeds that can be raised up as they grow can be helpful in terms of seedlings that get too stretched or leggy. And don't forget about your hardening off. So when your catalog says that your cabbage is hardy, it's not hardy if you started it indoors at 70 degrees and then you suddenly put it outside at 30. That's not what that means. There has to be a transition. So hardiness is, I think I misworded this here. It is relevant to, well, it isn't relevant to the seedling stage. Hardiness would make more sense as the plant has more maturity and has had chance to transition into those cool temperatures. All right, so I think I used up most of the time, but I do not mind to stay a little longer to answer questions. I sincerely hope that this has been helpful for folks. I've got my email here if it's easier to send a question in email. And what have we got in the Q&A?
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much, Nicole. We will follow up with a few remaining questions, but for those of you who would like to sign off, that is the end of the presentation. And just a note, I put the link in again, the chat that will host the recording of this session with Nicole, as well as our upcoming sessions and how to register. And hopefully we'll work all the kinks out this time. So thanks again, Nicole, and thanks everyone for joining. We do have a few other questions here, and sorry, Kate, you asked a question early on. Kate is wondering, she has a really tall 6-foot support structure that she wants to use for a cherry tomato. Can you recommend a tall variety?
You know, my most experience with cherry tomatoes has been Sweet 100, and I don't think I've ever seen them get that tall. There is a yellow pear that may be an heirloom variety that can get pretty leggy. I've had it, this is anecdotal, but my kids used to eat that, and they must have had some that they threw in a bush, but I've had yellow pear tomatoes that actually grew up over top of my shrubbery from ones that the kids threw the previous year, and those definitely got 6 feet tall. So that might, it's not quite a cherry, but might be worth a try.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about, let's see here. Would you suggest root boost for young plants? I'm not sure what they mean by root boost.
So there's a variety of products on the market that are seedling starters or transplant boosts. And so most of those are pretty high in B vitamins and have pretty weak fertilizer. And it's an alternative that is designed for root development as opposed to like hitting them with a full strength fertilizer. So those used to be really popular back in the days when I worked in a garden center. And you know, the idea behind them is they're giving like that small dose of nutrients without like overpowering, but there's a lot to do with B vitamins, I think, in some of those. A lot of folks really like them.
All right, thank you, Nicole. Let's see, how would you recommend slowly transitioning seeds from inside to outside or hardening off?
So the ideal way would be to be able to move the plants in and out so that they're exposed to ever increasingly cooler temperatures. That's easiest to do when we're
Did she freeze for you too?
Oh yeah. Nicole, you're frozen. Let's see if we can get her back here. I know her.
Did you want me to post the survey link?
okay, I think it was frozen for a minute, so I'm not sure where I lost people.
There you are, you're back. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I got cut off there. I just realized at some point that I was frozen. I'm so sorry.
No problem. And quickly, we do have a survey link in the chat if everyone wouldn't mind going there and answering a few questions about the talk today. We'll also send it out in an email after this. You were talking about hardening off, Nicole.
Oh, thank you. So ideally, you're increasingly exposing the plants to colder and colder temperatures. So that's easiest to do when we're home, so you can move them in and out as needed. So you want them to not be at freezing temperatures when you move them from the house, but increasingly cooler and cooler. And then once you stop, once you get to a certain point, then you can start covering them at night. In my house, I might put them on the southern exposure of the house where they're going to get a lot of sun, and then cover them in mid-afternoon so they trap a little bit of that heat in before the light goes down. Other folks will use transitioning them from inside the heated home to a garage or some type of mini season extension enclosure, so that there's a transition from like room temperature to almost the outdoor elements, and then after a week or two there, put them outside.
Thank you. And then we have a few other questions revolving around fixing leggy seedlings and also LED versus fluorescent lights for starting seeds.
So with the lights, we're not trying to hit flowering, right? So both of those types of lights have spectrums. One promotes vegetative growth and one promotes flowering. At the seedling stage, we're really looking for vegetative growth. I don't have as much experience with LED lights. They tend to be more expensive than the fluorescents by probably an order of magnitude the last time I checked. They can be really cool if you really get into indoor growing though, because there's such a variety of ways that you can focus the light on the plants, right? So I've even seen LED lights on drop strings so you can get light in your plants for ripening indoors. So, but they do tend to be more expensive. It's more about the spectrum for the seedlings. You want to promote the vegetative growth.
Okay, thank you. And then Connie's asking, do you need to harden off in summer when the outdoor temperatures are higher than the indoor growing area? Okay.
No, but they might want some shade the first few days so they can transition to the intense sunlight. I like the way she's thinking.
Yep. Okay. And I'm not sure if Carolyn is on here, but the only other question I have left is, did we supply a link for a mid-determinate Roma tomato, or where they might find information on that?
That Totally Tomatoes catalog.
Okay.
We'll have that.
Okay. So
And
Carolyn,
I think
if you,
Territorial Seed Company also had some.
okay, thank you. And is there a specific spectrum you suggest for the lights?
So I'm sorry, I always have to look and see which is the flowering, and I always have to look it up. I can't retain that. So it's vegetative versus flowering and red versus blue. Andrea or Erica, if you remember that off the top of your head, you're welcome to key in. But Oregon is abundant with stores that focus on indoor growing. And I promise you that the people in the stores know the answer when you go to buy the light.
Perfect. Okay. Oh, so I guess we didn't fully answer Becky's question about fixing seedlings that are already leggy. Are they kind of pause at that point, or is there a better way to plant them out once they, once you get them out of the propagation greenhouse?
Yeah, that's really tough. I think to some degree it depends on the plant type. So for instance, a tomato is way more forgiving, a tomato or pepper, because with those, you can actually bury the leggy part of the stem. But in a lot of other plants, if you do that, you're going to end up rotting it. So it's very dependent on which type of plant that you're trying to do. And also how leggy it's gotten, a little bit. I think if we lowered lights or got more light intensity, the plants would recover. Once they're like completely fallen over, or you've got significant stretching, especially before the first set of true leaves, I think they get a lot harder to recover from. I hope that helps a little more.
Yeah, I think so. That's all the questions that I am seeing right now, and we're, over. All right. Oh, we're trying to figure out how to send out the chat. So I will have a copy of that, and if you want a copy of the chat, just email me and I can send it out to you. And I think other than that, we are pretty much wrapped up. Oh, one more. Is there a good DIY plan for making a grow mat, since they are expensive to buy?
And that.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Monica. You might do a little research and see if there are some good DIY plans out there.
Yeah, so it's challenging because you're mixing electricity and water, so I would not speak to that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Again, we will post the recording on the website that is in the chat. And if you would like a copy of the chat, please email me and I will send it to you. But other than that, thank you for attending. Apologies again for the technical issues, but we hope to see you guys on February 9th. And thank you so much again, Nicole. It was a great presentation and we really appreciate you guys all tuning in. And now everyone can cozy up inside with hot beverage of their choice and try to weather the ugliness that is over here in the Willamette Valley.
With your seed catalog.
Our seed catalogs, exactly. That's what I'm doing. I put my order in today, actually.
Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate your help from the team there, and we appreciate our participants being here. Thanks a bunch.
Bye-bye.